Chapter 4 of the Madman and the Pirate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 4. Let us waft ourselves away now over the sea in pursuit of the strange bark which had treated the good people of Ratinga so cavalierly. Richard Roscoe sits in the cabin of the vessel, for it is he who commands her. He has taken her as a prize, and, finding her a good vessel in all respects, had adopted her in preference to the old piratical-looking schooner. A seaman stands before him. "It is impossible, I tell you," says Roscoe, while a troubled expression crosses his features, which have not improved since we saw him upwards of 3 years ago. "The distance between the two islands is so great that it is not probable he traversed it in a canoe, especially when we consider that he did not know the island's name or position, and was raving mad when I put him ashore." "That may be so, captain," says the sailor. "Nevertheless, I seed him with my own eyes, and no mistake. Didn't you say he was a man that nobody could mistake? Tall, broad, powerful, handsome, black curly hair, short beard and moustache, with sharp eyes and a pleasant smile?" "The same, in every particular, and just bordering on middle age," answers the perplexed pirate. "Well, as to age, I can't say much about that," returns the seaman. "He seemed to me more like a young man than a middle-aged one, but he had coolness and cheek enough for 150, or any age you like." "Strange," muttered Roscoe to himself, paying no regard to the last observation. "I wish that I or Mr. Redford had gone with you, or someone who had seen him the last time we were here, but I didn't want to be recognized." Then, checking himself, "Well, you may go, and send Mr. Redford to me." "I cannot account for Zeppa turning up in this way," he said, when the mate entered. "No more can I, sir." "Do all the men agree in saying that he seems to be quite sane?" "All. Indeed, most of them seemed surprised when I asked the question. You see, what with death by sword, shot, and sickness, there's not a man in the ship who ever saw him, except yourself and me. The last of the old hands, you know, went with Captain Daniel when you sent him and the unwilling men away in the old schooner. I have no doubt myself, from what they say, that Zeppa has got well again and managed to return home as sound and sane as you or I." "If you and I were sane we should not be here," thought the pirate captain, but he did not give expression to the thought, save by a contemptuous curl of his lip. "Well, Redford," he said, after a few seconds' pause, "my chief reason for going to Sugarloaf Island is removed. Nevertheless, we shall still go there for a fresh load of sandalwood and other things that will fetch a good price." "I fear, sir," returned the mate after some hesitation, "that the crew will be apt to mutiny if you insist on going there. They are tired of this mixture of trade with free roving, and are anxious to sail in seas where we shall be more likely to fall in with something worth picking up." "Stop, Redford. I want to hear no more. The crew shall go where I please, as long as I command them, and you may add that I will guarantee their being pleased with my present plan. There, don't refer to this subject again. Where did you say the British cruiser was last seen?" "Bearing northeast, sir, hull down, on our starboard quarter. I called you at once, but she had changed her course to northwest, and we lost sight of her." "That will just suit us," said Roscoe, going into his private cabin and shutting the door. Well might the pirate captain be perplexed at that time, for he was surrounded by difficulties, not the least of which was that his men were thoroughly dissatisfied with him, and he with them. He did not find his crew sufficiently ready to go in for lucrative kidnapping of natives when the chance offered, and they did not find their captain sufficiently ferocious and bloodthirsty when prizes came in their way. Nevertheless, through the influence of utter recklessness, contemptuous disregard of death, and an indomitable will, backed by wonderful capacity and aptitude in the use of fist, sword, and pistol, he had up to this time held them in complete subjection. In his heart Roscoe had resolved to quit his comrades at the first favourable opportunity, and, with this intent, had been making for one of the most out-of-the-way islands in the Pacific, there to go and live among the natives, and never more to see the faces of civilized men against whom he had sinned so grievously. His intentions were hastened by the fact that a British man of war on the Vancouver station, hearing of his exploits, had resolved to search for him, and this cruiser did in fact come across his track and gave chase, but being a poor sailor, was left behind just before the pirate had reached Ratinga, where, as we have seen, she put in for water. The discovery there made, as he supposed, that Antonio Zeppa had recovered his reason and returned home, not only amazed and puzzled Rosco, but disconcerted part of his plan, which was to find Zeppa, whose image had never ceased to trouble his conscience, and, if possible, convey him to the neighbourhood of some port whence he could easily return to Ratinga. It now struck him that, since Zeppa was no longer on Sugarloaf Island, that spot would be as favourable a one as could be found for his purpose, being far removed from the usual tracks of commerce. He would go there, take to the mountains as Zeppa had done before him, leave his dissatisfied comrades to follow their own devices, and, crossing over to the other side of the island, ingratiate himself as well as he could with the natives, grow beard and moustache, which he had hitherto shaved, and pass himself off as a shipwrecked sailor, should any vessel or cruiser touch there. And shipwrecked I am, body, soul, and spirit, he muttered bitterly, as he sat in his cabin, brooding over the past and future. Leaving him there and thus, we will return to Ratinga, the peaceful inhabitants of which were destined at this time to be tickled with several little shocks of more or less agreeable surprise. One of these shocks was the sudden disappearance of Zariffa, the native missionary's brown baby. It was an insignificant event in itself, and is only mentioned because of its having led indirectly to events of greater importance. Zariffa had by that time passed out of the condition of brown babyhood. She had, to her own intense delight, been promoted to the condition of a decently clad little savage. In addition to the scuttle bonnet, which was not quite so tremulous as that of her mother, she now sported a blue flannel petticoat. This was deemed sufficient for her, the climate being warm. Zariffa was still, however, too young to take care of herself. Great, therefore, was Betty Waroonga's alarm when she missed her one day from her little bed where she should have been sleeping. "Ebony!" cried Betsy, turning sharply round and glaring. "Zariffa's gone!" "Quite dead!" exclaimed the negro, aghast. "Not at all dead," said Betsy, "but gone out of her bed." "Dat no great misfortune, missus," returned Ebony, with a sigh of relief. "It's little you knows, stupid feller," returned the native missionary's wife, while her coal scuttle shook with imparted emotion. "Zariffa never disobeyed me in her life. She's lost. We must seek quick." The sympathetic negro became again anxious, and looked hastily under the chairs and tables for the lost one, while her mother opened and searched a corner cupboard that could not have held a child half her size. Then the pair became more and more distracted as each excited the other, and ran to the various outhouses, shouting "Zariffa!" anxiously, entreatingly, despairing. They gathered natives as they ran, hither and thither, searching every nook and corner, and burst at last in an excited crowd into the presence of Waroonga himself, who was in the act of detailing the history of Joseph to a select class of scholars, varying from 7 to 17 years of age. "Oh, massa, Zariffa's lost!" cried Ebony. Waroonga glanced quickly at his wife. The excessive agitation of her bonnet told its own tale. The missionary threw Joseph overboard directly, proclaimed a holiday, and rushed out of the schoolhouse. "No use to go home, massa," cried Ebony. "We search everywhere dar. No find her." "Has you been to the piggery?" demanded the anxious father, who was well aware of his child's fondness for "little squeakers." "Oh, yas, been dar. I rousted out de old sow, for to make sure Zariffa no hides behind her." At this juncture Orlando came up with a sack of cocoa nuts on his back. Hearing what had occurred, he took the matter in hand with his wonted energy. "We must organize a regular search," he said, throwing down the sack, "and go to work at once, for the day is far advanced, and we can do little or nothing after dark." So saying, he collected all the able men of the village, divided them into bands, gave them minute though hurried directions where they were to go, and what signals they were to give in the event of the child being found, and then, heading one of the bands, he joined eagerly in the search. But, before going, he advised Betsy Waroonga to keep his mother company, as women could not be of much use in such work. "No," said Mrs. Waroonga with decision, "we will go home and pray." "Right, that will be better," said Orlando. "You go back with her, Ebony, and fetch my gun. I left it in Waroonga's house when I went in for a sack to hold the cocoa nuts. It is behind the door. You'll find me searching in the palm grove. Now, boys, away! We've no time to lose." Returning to her house with her sable attendant, poor Betsy rushed into her private apartment, threw herself on her knees, and half across her lowly bed, in an agony of alarm. She was startled and horrified by a sharp though smothered cry, while some living creature heaved under the bedclothes. Instantly she swept them off, and lo! there lay Zariffa, safe and well, though somewhat confused by her rude awaking and her mother's weight. "You's keep up heart, missus," said the sympathetic Ebony, looking hastily into the room in passing. "We's sartin to find—" He stopped. Blazing amazement sat on his countenance for about 6 moments, a pause similar to that of an injured infant just preparing for a yell. Then he exploded into a fit of laughter so uncontrollable that it seemed as if a hurricane had been suddenly let loose in the room, insomuch that Betsy's remonstrances were quite unheard. "Oh, missus!" he exclaimed at last, wiping his eyes, "I's a goin' to bust!" "Yas, and I'll help you do it," she replied impatiently, seizing an old shoe and laying it on the negro's bare back with a crack like a pistol shot. Ebony strove to calm himself. "Go 'long, you noisy fella, and tell Waroonga to stop the search." It was plain that Ebony had not sufficiently relieved his feelings, for his broad chest heaved, and ominous sounds came out of his nose. "Only tink," he said, "dat you hoed down to say yo's prayers on de berry top o' de baby." The thought was too much for him. He exploded again, and, rushing from the house, ascended the hills, and filled the groves as he went with hilarious melody. But he did not find Orlando, who had completed his search of the palm grove, and passed over the ridge that formed the summit of the island in that part. It was by no means the highest part, but from it could be seen a large bay which lay on the side of the island opposite to the mission village. And here he beheld the cause of another of the little surprises with which we have said the people of Ratinga were visited at that time. It was a stately man of war, with the Union Jack flying from her peak, and her sails backed so as to check her way. A boat was being lowered from her side, and Orlando with his party hastened to the beach to meet it. The officer in command was evidently not aware that he had come to an island where the peaceful influences of the gospel of Jesus prevailed, for, on landing, he drew up his men, who were all armed to receive either as friends or foes the party of natives who advanced towards him. The officer was not a little surprised to observe that the natives were led by a white man, who halted them when within about 300 yards off, and advanced alone and unarmed to the beach. "I'm happy to welcome you and offer hospitality," said Orlando, taking off his cap. "Thanks, good sir, I accept your offer most gladly," returned the officer, holding out his hand, "all the more heartily that I had expected to meet with none but savages here." "We are Christians, thank God," said Orlando. "Then this must be the island of Ratinga, of which we've heard so much of late." "Even so." "But where, then, is your village, your church?" asked the officer, looking round. "It is on the other side of the island. If you'll take your ship round there, you will find good anchorage and fresh water, of which last, if I may judge from the casks in your boat, you are in search." The officer at once acted on this advice, and Orlando accompanied him on board to pilot the vessel around. On the way the captain, Fitzgerald, asked if any suspicious craft had been seen lately, and on hearing that a barque, flying British colours, had put in there only a day or two before, said that he had been sent out in chase of that barque, as she was commanded by a celebrated and rather eccentric pirate named Rosco. "I know him well," said Orlando quickly. "He was mate of a schooner which called here between 3 and 4 years ago. It was commanded by a poor fellow named Daniel, who, I fear, was murdered by his crew. Alas! I have only too good reason to remember it." He then related the visit of the piratical-looking schooner to Ratinga, its departure with his father and himself on board, the mutiny, and all the other circumstances connected with that memorable event. "And have you never heard of your father since then?" asked Captain Fitzgerald. "Never. I am almost forced to the conclusion that he must have been murdered by the mutineers, for if he had escaped them he would surely, long ere now, have managed to find his way home. And yet I cannot help feeling that perhaps God may have spared his life, and may yet restore him to us." "It is perhaps cruel to encourage hopes which may be doomed to bitter disappointment," returned the captain, regarding Orlando's sad face with a look of sympathy, "but it is by no means impossible that your father may be alive. Listen, I too know something of this affair, and will tell you all I know. Captain Daniel, of the schooner whose crew mutinied, was not murdered. This Rosco seems to have had, all through his career, a strong tendency to mercy, so much so that his men have threatened his own life more than once. At the same time he possesses great power over them, and has held them for many years under command. We have heard of him more than once from persons whom he has set free, after taking their vessels, among others from Captain Daniel, who turned up in Vancouver's Island. It seems that after you were thrown overboard and supposed to be drowned, your poor father went, that is to say, his mind was unhinged, owing, no doubt, to the combined effect of your supposed murder and the two terrible blows by which he was felled during the mutiny." "My father mad!" exclaimed Orlando, in a low, horrified tone, clasping his hands and gazing into Captain Fitzgerald's face. "Nay, I did not say mad. It was a great shock, you know, and quite sufficient to account for temporary derangement. Then Rosco sailed away to a distant island, where he put your father ashore and left him." "What island? Did you hear its name?" asked Orlando quickly. "It is an almost unknown island, not marked or named in any chart, but it has been seen by one of the mutineers on one of his early voyages, and named Sugarloaf Island from its shape. Well, after leaving the island Rosco attacked and easily captured a large merchantman. Finding it both good and new, he's transhipped all that was worth retaining, including arms and guns, into this barque, and took command. Then he assembled his men, asked who were willing to follow him, put those who were unwilling into the old schooner with Captain Daniel at their head, and left them to sail where they pleased. They landed, as I have said, at Vancouver's Island. The pirate Rosco and his barque, the Flame, have become notorious since then, both for daring and eccentricity, and I have been ordered to get hold of them, if possible. Now, I mean to go to Sugarloaf Island because, from various things I have heard of this scoundrel, I think it not unlikely that he will go there." "And you will let me go with you?" suddenly exclaimed Orlando in a voice of earnest entreaty. "I will, my poor fellow," returned the captain, "but don't be too sanguine, and let me advise you to say nothing of all this to your mother." "You are right. She must not know, at least not now. It will be the first time in my life I have had a secret from my mother, but she must not know till we return." That night there was great rejoicing in Ratinga, because of the recovery, if we may so call it, of Zariffa, and the visit of the British man of war. In the midst of the rejoicings a huge, lustrous pair of black eyes gazed earnestly into Orlando's face, and an enormously thick pair of red lips said, "I go too, massa, eh?" "Well, you may, Ebony, if the captain will let you. He has already agreed to take the missionary and the chiefs Tomeo and Buttchee, but mind, not a whisper of our secret hope to anyone." Thus, with the approval of Madame Zeppa and Betsy Waroonga, these 5 representatives of Ratinga embarked on board the British man of war and left the island. End of chapter 4. The Madman and the Pirate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 5. We left the poor madman, Antonio Zeppa, wandering aimlessly up into the mountains of Sugarloaf Island. Whether it was the loss of his beloved Orley alone that had turned his brain, or that loss coupled with the injury to his head, we cannot tell. But certain it is that the outward and visible violence of his great sorrow seemed to depart from him after he had entered the rugged defiles of the mountain range. His mental malady appeared to take the form of simple indifference and inactivity. Sometimes he muttered to himself as he went slowly and wearily along, but generally he was silent, with his chin sunk upon his breast as he gazed upon the ground with lacklustre eyes. At other times he started and looked around him with a sharp, inquiring, almost timid glance. But the gleam of memory, if such it was, soon passed away, and his handsome face resumed the gentle, almost childish look which had settled down on it. But never again did he give vent to the heart-broken cries and wails which had marked the first stage of his derangement. The mutterings to which we have referred were seldom coherent, but the disjointed utterances sufficed to indicate the natural character of the man. As the ruling passion is said to become dominant in death, so in this death of reason which appeared to have passed upon Zeppa, love of his wife and child and the natives of Ratinga, as well as profound reverence and love to his God, became conspicuous in the broken sentences that occasionally dropped from his lips. At first he had been like some grand instrument thrown wildly out of tune and swept by a reckless hand. Now he resembled the same instrument with the framework shattered, the strings hanging loose, and the music of discord as well as harmony gone forever. Oh, it was sad, inexpressibly sad, to see the grand and good man, the image of himself, yet not himself, with bowed head and bent form, the very personification of humility, wandering forth on that lonely island of the southern seas. After quitting the shore he continued slowly to ascend the mountain until he gained the summit. Here, seating himself on a rock, he lifted his eyes and looked slowly around him. It was a glorious sight that met his unintelligent gaze. On the side which he had ascended, the mountain sloped abruptly into the sea, yet its precipices were not forbidding or gloomy, for they were clothed with the luxuriant and lovely vegetation of those favoured regions. The rocks were fringed with grasses and wild flowers, the cliffs were softened by palmated leaves and gorgeous shrubs. Wild fruits in abundance grew on every side. In short, the land presented the appearance of a terrestrial paradise. On the other side of the range similar but softer scenery rolled away for several miles in easy slopes, until it terminated in a plain, the farther end of which was bounded by the white sands of the shore. Around all lay the great sea, like a transparent blue shield, on which the sun glinted in myriad ripples of burnished gold. Everywhere God's work was glorious, but God's image in man was not there, for poor Zeppa looked upon it all with total indifference. The schooner was still visible from that lofty outlook, like a snowflake on the sea, but Zeppa saw it or regarded it not. On the shore of the island furthest from the mountain, the clustering huts of a native village could be seen, but Zeppa looked at it without a gleam of interest, and passed it over as if it were a group of ant hills. Hunger, however, soon claimed his attention. After remaining motionless for more than an hour, he arose and plucked some fruit from a neighbouring tree. "God is good, has always been good to me and mine," he murmured, as he placed the fruit on the grass and sat down beside it. Then, clasping his hands and closing his eyes, he asked a blessing on his food in the same words and tone which he had been wont to use when at home. After his hunger was appeased, he again wandered about apparently without aim, but as night began to descend, he sought and found a slightly hollowed part of a cliff with an overhanging ledge. It was scarcely deep enough to be styled a cave, but appeared to be a sufficient shelter in the maniac's eyes, for he busied himself in gathering ferns and dried grass, until he had made himself a comfortable couch at the inner end of it. Before lying down he knelt, clasped his hands, and poured out his soul in fervent prayer. His words were now no longer incoherent, and the burthen of his petition was, a blessing for the dear ones at home, and forgiveness of all his sins through Jesus Christ. It seemed evident, judging by his words, that he had forgotten the recent past, and imagined that Orlando was still alive. Then he lay down and fell asleep. Thus days and weeks and months rolled on, and still the madman wandered aimlessly among the mountain peaks. The savages at the other end of the island never molested him, for, having no occasion to clamber up these rocky heights, they did not become aware of his existence until a considerable time had elapsed. His discovery at last was the result of a crime. One of the savages committed a theft in the native village, and fled for refuge to the mountains. Wapoota, being a funny fellow, was a favourite with his chief Ongoloo, and occupied a position somewhat analogous to the court jester of old. Moreover, he was often consulted in serious matters by his chief, in short, was a sort of humorous prime minister. But he could not resist the tendency to steal, and one day pilfered something or other from Ongoloo, who finally lost patience with him, for he was an old offender. Ongoloo, though neither a warlike nor ferocious fellow, vowed to cut out the heart and liver of Wapoota and expose them to public gaze. Disliking publicity after this fashion, the thief fled, proposing to abide in the mountains until his chief's wrath should have evaporated. Rambling one day in his mountain refuge, the dishonest savage turned a jutting point of rock, and suddenly stood face to face with Zeppa. His jaw dropped, his eyes glared, His knees smote together, and lemon yellow took the place of brown ochre on his cheeks. It was an awkward place of meeting, for the path, if we may so style it, was a mere ledge, with a perpendicular cliff on one side, a precipice on the other. And well might the savage be overcome with fear on such a spot with such a man before him, for, in addition to his commanding stature, Zeppa had now the wild appearance resulting from long untrimmed locks and a shaggy beard. Both locks and beard had also changed from black to iron grey during these months of lonely wandering. His dress, too, had become much disordered and ragged, so that altogether his appearance and fierce aspect were eminently fitted to strike terror to the heart of a more courageous man than Wapoota, who happened to be rather mild in disposition. After the first stare of astonishment, he sank on his knees and held up his hands as if supplicating mercy, but he had nothing to fear from the maniac. "My poor fellow," said Zeppa in English, laying his hand on the native's head and patting it, "do not fear. I will not harm you." Of course Wapoota did not understand the words, but he fully appreciated the action, and the lemon yellow began to fade while the brown ochre returned. Without uttering another word, Zeppa took Wapoota by the hand and led him to his cave, where he set before him such fruits as remained over from his last meal, and then, sitting down, gazed abstractedly on the ground. Wapoota ate from fear of offending his host rather than hunger. When he had finished, Zeppa rose, pointed to his couch at the inner part of the cave, nodded to him with a kindly smile, and left him. At first the savage seemed disposed to make off when Zeppa's back was turned, but when he saw him slowly ascend the hill, with his head bowed down, he changed his mind, made some significant grimaces, which we will not attempt to explain, and lay down to sleep. On his return Wapoota tried to enter into conversation with his host, but Zeppa only smiled, patted him gently on the head and shoulder, and paid no further attention to him. The savage was somewhat overawed by such treatment. Observing his host more closely, it soon began to dawn upon him that he was in the power of a madman, and some tinges of the lemon yellow reappeared. But when he perceived that Zeppa was not merely a harmless but an exceedingly gentle madman, his confidence and the brown ochre reasserted themselves. Thus for several days the madman and the savage dwelt amicably together, and slept side by side during the night. But Zeppa made it very apparent that he did not wish for his visitor's society during the daytime, and the visitor had the sense to let him wander forth alone. Wapoota was mistaken when he calculated on the cooling of Ongoloo's wrath. That angry chief, bent on the fulfilment of his anatomical vow, set forth with a small party of picked men to explore the sugar loaf in quest of the runaway. He found him one day gathering fruits for Zeppa's supper, for Wapoota had already become a sort of attached Friday to this unfortunate Crusoe. On beholding his countryman, the thief's visage underwent a series of remarkable changes, for he knew that escape was impossible, and the expression of his chief's face forbade him to hope for mercy. "I have found you, mine enemy," growled Ongoloo, of course in the native tongue. "Mercy!" exclaimed Wapoota in piteous tone. "Mercy no longer dwells in my breast," returned the chief. In proof of the truth of this assertion, he ordered his men to seize and bind Wapoota, and proceed at once with the execution of his cruel purpose. The unfortunate wretch, unable to face the appalling prospect, gave vent to a series of terrible shrieks, and struggled fiercely while they bound him. But in vain would he have struggled if his cries for mercy had not reached other ears than those of his countrymen. Not far from the spot where the thief had been captured, Zeppa chanced to be sitting, idly toying with the branch of a tree which he had fashioned into a rude staff wherewith to climb the mountain more easily. When the first shriek rang among the cliffs, it seemed to startle the maniac out of the depressing lethargy under which he had laboured so long. He sprang up and listened, with dilated eyes and partly opened mouth. Again and again the shrieks rang out, and were echoed from cliff to cliff. As a tigress bounds to the rescue of her young, so sprang Zeppa down the hillside in the direction of the cries. He came suddenly to the edge of a cliff which overlooked the scene, and beheld a savage just about to plunge a knife into Wapoota's breast. Zeppa gave vent to a tremendous roar, which terminated in a wild laugh. Then he wrenched a mass of rock from the cliffs and hurled it down. The height was greater than any sane man would have ventured to leap even to save his life, but the maniac gave no time to thought. He followed the mass of rock with another wild laugh, and next moment stood in the midst of the savage group. These men were no cowards. They were Ongoloo's picked warriors, and would have scorned to fly before a single foe, however large or fierce. But when they saw plainly that Zeppa was a white man and a maniac, they turned, with one consent, and fled as if a visitant from the nether realms had assailed them. Zeppa did not follow. All his sudden wrath vanished with the enemy. He turned calmly to the prostrate man, cut his bonds, and set him free. Then, without saying a word, he patted him on the shoulder, and wandered listlessly away with his head drooped as of old. You may be sure that Wapoota did not hesitate to make good use of his freedom. He fled on the wings, or legs, of fear to the most inaccessible recesses of the mountains, from which he did not emerge till night had enshrouded land and sea. Then he crept stealthily back to Zeppa's cave, and laid himself quietly down beside his friend. The inherent tendency of Zeppa's nature was towards peace and goodwill. Even in his madness and misery, his spirit trickled, if it did not run, in the customary direction. His dethroned reason began, occasionally, to make fitful efforts after some plan which it sought to evolve. But before the plan could be arranged, much less carried out, the dull sense of a leaden grief overwhelmed it again, and he relapsed into the old condition of quiet apathy. Chance, however, brought about that which the enfeebled intellect could not compass. One day, whether inadvertently or not we cannot tell, Zeppa wandered down in the direction of the native settlement. That same day Ongoloo wandered towards the mountain, and the two men suddenly met so close to each other that there was no possibility of escape to either. But, sooth to say, there was no thought of escape in the breast of either. Ongoloo, being a brave savage, was ashamed of having given way to panic at his first meeting with the madman. Besides, he carried his huge war club, while his opponent was absolutely unarmed, having forgotten to take his usual staff with him that day. As for Zeppa, he had never at any time feared the face of man, and, in his then condition, would have faced man or fiend with equal indifference. But the sight of the savage chief seemed to recall something to his mind. He stood with his arms crossed, and an expression of perplexity on his countenance, while Ongoloo assumed an attitude of defence. Suddenly a beaming smile overspread Zeppa's face. We have already said that his smile had fascination in it. The effect on the savage was to paralyze him for the moment. Zeppa advanced, took Ongoloo's face between both hands, and placing his nose against that of the chief, gently rubbed it. For the benefit of the ignorant we may explain that this is the usual salutation of friendship among some of the South Sea Islanders. Ongoloo returned the rub and dropped his club. He was obviously glad of this peaceful termination to the rencontre. Then, for the first time, it occurred to Zeppa to use the language of Ratinga. The chief evidently understood it. "God is love," said Zeppa solemnly, pointing upward with his finger. "God forgives. You will forgive, and so be like God." The chief was completely overawed by Zeppa's grandeur and gentleness. He had never before seen the two qualities combined. Zeppa took him by the hand, as he had previously taken Wapoota, and led him up into the mountains. The chief submitted meekly, as if he thought a being from the better world were guiding him. On reaching the cave they found Wapoota arranging the supper table, if we may so express it, for he had been in the habit of doing this for some time past, about sunset, at which time his protector had invariably returned home. Alas, it was a poor home. To say that Wapoota was transfixed or petrified on beholding Ongoloo would not convey the full idea of his condition. It is useless to say that he glared, that his knees smote, or that lemon yellow supplanted brown ochre on his visage. Words can do much, but they cannot describe the state of that savage on that occasion. The reader's imagination is much more likely to do justice to the situation. To that we leave it. But who or what language shall describe the state of mind into which both Ongoloo and Wapoota were thrown when Zeppa, having brought them close to each other, grasped them firmly by their necks and rubbed their noses forcibly together? There was no resisting the smile with which this was done. The chief and the thief first glanced at each other, then at their captor, and then they laughed, absolutely roared, after which they rubbed noses of their own accord and made it up. We may remark in passing that Ongoloo was not sorry for the reconciliation, because Wapoota had become necessary to him both in council and during relaxation, and of late he had come to feel low-spirited for want of his humorist. But both of them were much concerned to observe that after this reconciliation the reconciler relapsed into his pensive mood and refused to be interested in anything. They tried in vain to rouse him from his strange apathy, which neither of them could at all understand. Next day Ongoloo took occasion to give him the slip and returned to his village. Zeppa cared nothing for that. He did not even ask Wapoota what had become of him. At this time a new idea occurred to Wapoota, who had been ordered by his chief to induce Zeppa to visit the native village. It struck him that as he had been led, so he might lead. Therefore, one morning he waited until Zeppa had finished breakfast, and when he rose, as was his wont, to go off for the day, Wapoota took him gently by the hand and led him forth. To his surprise and comfort, for he had strong misgivings, Zeppa submitted. He did not seem to think that the act was peculiar. Wapoota led him quietly and slowly down the mountain side, and so, by degrees, right into the native village, where Ongoloo was, of course, prepared to meet and welcome him. He was received by the head man of the tribe with deep respect, and conducted to a tent which had been prepared for him, where Wapoota, who had constituted himself his servant, or lieutenant, made him comfortable for the night. Zeppa at first expressed some surprise at all the fuss that was made regarding him, but soon ceased to trouble himself about the matter, and gradually relapsed into his old condition. He was content to remain with the natives, though he did not cease his lonely wanderings among the hills, absenting himself for days at a time, but always returning, sooner or later, to the tent that had been provided for him in the village. Now, in Sugarloaf Island there was a tribe that had, for years past, been at war with the tribe into whose hands Zeppa had thus fallen, and not long after the events just narrated, it chanced that the Ratura tribe, as it was named, resolved to have another brush with their old enemies, the subjects of Ongoloo. What they did, and how they did it, shall be seen in another chapter. End of chapter 5.
Of The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arrowit. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 6. After Zeppa had remained a short time in his new quarters, he began to take an interest in the children of his savage friends. At first the mothers of the village were alarmed when they saw their little ones in his strong arms, playing with his beard, which had by that time grown long and shaggy, as well as grey like his curly locks. But soon perceiving that the children had nothing to fear from the strange white man, they gave themselves no further concern on the subject. If Zeppa had been in his right mind when the savages first found him, it is probable that they would have hunted him down and slain him without remorse, for it is well known that many of the South Sea Islanders regard shipwrecked persons as victims who have no claim on their hospitality, but are a sort of windfall to be killed and devoured. Their treatment of Zeppa, therefore, must have been owing to some feeling of respect or awe, inspired by his obvious insanity, coupled, no doubt, with his commanding size and presence, as well as his singular conduct on the occasion of their first meeting. Whatever the reason, it is certain that the natives amongst whom the poor madman's lot had thus been cast treated him in an exceptional manner, and with an amount of respect that almost amounted to reverence. At first Ongoloo made a slight attempt to ascertain where his guest had come from, and what was his previous history, but as Zeppa always met such inquiries with one of his sweetest smiles, and with no verbal reply whatever, the chief felt unusually perplexed, dropped the subject, and began to regard the madman as a species of demigod. Of course no one else dared to question him, so that ever afterwards he remained in the eyes of his entertainers a great mystery. By degrees Zeppa became intimately acquainted with the little boys and girls of the village, and took much pleasure in watching them at play. They soon found out that he was fond of them, and might have become rather troublesome in their attentions to him, if he had been a busy man, but as he had nothing whatever to do except follow his own inclinations, and as his inclinations led him to sympathise with childhood, he was never ruffled by their familiarities or by their wild doings around his tent. He even suffered a very few of the smallest of the brown troop to take liberties with him and pull his beard. One brown mite in particular, a female baby of the smallest conceivable dimensions and the wildest possible spirit, became an immense favourite with him. Her name was Lippy, or some sound which that combination of letters produces. Lippy's mother, a large-eyed, good-looking young woman, with insufficient clothing, at least in the estimate of a Ratingite, was transfixed the first time she saw her little one practise her familiarities on their demigod. Zeppa was lying on his back at the time, in front of his hut, when Lippy prowled cautiously towards him, like a very small and sly kitten about to pounce on a very huge dog. She sprang, just as her mother caught sight of her, and was on his broad chest in a moment. The mother was, as we have said, transfixed with alarm. The human kitten seized Zeppa by the beard and laughed immoderately. Zeppa replied with a gentle smile. He never laughed out now, and remained quite still. Having finished her laugh, Lippy drew herself forward until she was close to her human dog's chin. At this point her mother would have rushed to the rescue, but she was still paralysed. Having reached the chin, Lippy became more audacious, stretched forth one of her little hands, and seized Zeppa's nose. Still he did not move, but when the little brown kitten proceeded to thrust a thumb into one of his eyes, he roused himself, seized the child in his powerful hands, and raised her high above his head, then, lowering her until her little mouth was within reach, he kissed her. This sufficed to relieve the mother's fears, so she retired quietly from the scene. She was not so easily quieted, however, some weeks later, when she beheld Zeppa, after amusing himself one day with Lippy for half an hour, start up, place her on his shoulder, and stalk off toward the mountains. He absented himself for 3 days on that occasion. Lippy's mother at first became anxious, then terrified, then desperate. She roused Ongoloo to such a pitch that he at last called a council of war. Some of the head men were for immediate pursuit of the madman, others were of opinion that the little brat was not worth so much trouble. A few wretches even expressed the opinion that they were well rid of her, there being already too many female babies in the community. While the conflict of opinions was at its fiercest, Zeppa stalked into the middle of them with Lippy on his shoulder, looked round with a benignant expression of countenance, delivered the child to her mother, and went off to his hut without uttering a word. The council immediately dissolved itself and retired humiliated. It was during one of Zeppa's occasional absences that the Ratura tribe of natives, as before mentioned, decided to have another brush with the mountain men, as they styled their foes. We are not sure that the word used in the Ratura language was the exact counterpart of the words brush and scrimmage in ours, but it meant the same thing, namely, the cutting of a number of throats, or the battering in of a number of human skulls unnecessarily. Of course there was a casus belli. There always is among savage as well as civilized nations, and it is a curious coincidence that the reasons given for the necessity of war are about as comprehensible among the civilized as the savage. Of course, among civilized nations these reasons for war are said to be always good. Christians, you know, could not kill each other without good reasons. But is it not strange that among educated people the reasons given for going to war are often very much the reverse of clear? The origin of the war which was about to be revived, besides being involved in the mists of antiquity, was somewhat shrouded in the clouds of confusion. Cleared of these clouds, and delivered from these mists, it would have been obviously a just, nay, even a holy war, so both parties said, for they both wanted to fight. Unfortunately, no living man could clear away the clouds or mists. Nevertheless, as they all saw plainly the exceeding righteousness of the war, they could not in honour, in justice, or in common sense, do otherwise than go at it. At some remote period of antiquity, probably soon after the dispersion at Babel, it was said that the mountain men had said to the Raturans that it had been reported to them that a rumour had gone abroad that they, the men of Ratara, were casting covetous eyes on the summit of their mountain. The Raturans replied that it had never entered into their heads either to covet or to look at the summit of their mountain, but that, if they had any doubts on the subject, they might send over a deputation to meet a Ratara deputation, and hold a palaver to clear the matter up. The deputations were sent. They met. They palavered for about half an hour with an air of sententious sincerity. Then the leading chief of the mountaineer deputation cracked the crown of the leading chief of the Rataran deputation, and the two deputations spent the remainder of that day in fighting. Reinforcements came up on both sides. The skirmish became a pitched battle. Blood was shed lavishly. Heads were broken beyond repair, and women, coming to the aid of the men with the baskets of stones, were slain in considerable numbers, as well as little children who had an inconvenient but not uncommon habit of getting in the way of the combatants. At last the Raturans were driven into the impregnable swamps that bordered part of their country. Their villages and crops were burned, and those of their women and children who had not escaped to the swamps were carried into slavery, while the aged of both sexes were slaughtered in cold blood. It was a complete victory. We are inclined to think that the mountain men called it a glorious victory. Judging from the world's history, they probably did, and the mountain women ever afterwards were wont to tell their little ones of the prowess of their forefathers, of the skulls battered in and other deeds of heroism done in that just and reasonable war. As centuries rolled on, the old story came to be repeated again and over again, with slight variations to suit the varying ages. In particular, it came to be well understood and asserted that unconquerable desire of the Raturans to take possession of the mountain top was growing apace, and had to be jealously watched and curbed. In one of the centuries, we are not sure which, the Rataran savages made some advances into their swampy grounds, and began to improve them. This region lay very remote from the mountain men's villages, but, as it approached the mountain base in a roundabout manner, and as the mountain tops could be distinctly seen from the region, although well-nigh impassable swamps still lay between the reclaimed lands and the mountain base, these advances were regarded as another casus belli, and another war was waged, with practically the same results, damage to everybody concerned and good to no one. Thus was the game kept up until the chief Ongoloo began to strut his little hour upon the stage of time. There are always men, savage as well as civilized in every region and age, who march in advance of their fellows, either because of intellectual capacity or moral rectitude or both. Ongoloo was one of these. He did not believe in war at any price. He thought it was probable that God lived in a state of peace, and argued that what was best for the Creator must naturally be best for the creature. He therefore tried to introduce a peace policy into Sugarloaf Island. His efforts were not successful. The war party was too strong for him. At last he felt constrained to give in to the force of public opinion, and agreed to hold an unarmed palaver with the men of Ratara. The war at any price party would have preferred an armed palaver, but they were overruled. The Ratarans chanced at this time to be in somewhat depressed circumstances, owing to a sickness that had carried off many of their best warriors and left their lands partly waste, so that their finances, if we may so express it, were in a bad condition. Now is our chance, now or never, thought the war party, and pushed matters to extremity. On the day appointed for the palaver, one of the most pugnacious of the mountain men got leave to open the deliberations. "You're a low-minded, sneaking son of an ignorant father," he said to the spokesman of the Ratarans. "You're another," retorted his foe. Having disposed of these preliminary compliments, the speakers paused, glared, and breathed hard. "You and your greedy forefathers," resumed the mountain man, "have always kept your false eyes on our mountain top, and you are looking at it still." "That's a lie," returned the man of Ratara with savage simplicity. Had they been armed, it is probable that the palaver would have closed abruptly at this point. Seeing that the relations between the parties were strained almost to the breaking point, one of the less warlike among the Ratara chiefs caught his own spokesman by the nape of the neck and hurled him back among his comrades. "We have not, O valiant men of the mountain," he said in a gentle tone, "looked upon your hilltops with desire. We only wish to improve our swamps increase our sweet potato grounds, and live at peace." "That is not true," reported the fiery Mountain man, "and we must have a promise from you that you will let the swamps alone, and not advance one step nearer to the top of our mountain." "But the swamps are not yours," objected the other. "No matter, they are not yours. They are neutral ground, and must not be touched." "Well, we will not touch them," said the peaceful Raturan. This reply disconcerted the fiery mountaineer, for he was anxious to fight. "But that is not enough," he resumed, as a bright idea struck him. "You must promise not even to look at our mountain." The man of Ratura, reflecting how ill able his tribe was to go to war just then, agreed not even to look at the mountain. "More than that," resumed the mountaineer, "you must not even wink at it." "We will not even wink at it," replied his foe. "Still further," continued the warlike mountaineer in sheer desperation, "you must not even think of it." "We will not think of it," answered the accommodating man of Ratura. "Bah! You may go, you peace-loving cowards," said the disappointed mountaineer, turning on his heel in bitter disappointment. "Yes, you may go, in peace," said Ongoloo with sententious gravity, waving his band grandly to the retiring men of Ratura, and walking off with an air of profound solemnity, though he could not help laughing, in his arm somewhere, as he had not a sleeve to do it in. But the Raturans did not go in peace. They went away with bitter animosity in their hearts, and some of them resolved to have a brush with their old foes, come what might. Savages do not, as a rule, go through the formality of declaring war by withdrawing ambassadors. They are much more prone to begin war with that deceptive act styled a surprise. Smarting under the taunts of their foes, the Raturans resolved to make an attack on the enemy's village that very night, but Ongoloo was more than a match for them. Suspecting their intentions, he stalked them when the shades of evening fell, heard all their plans while concealed among the long grass, and then, hastening home, collected his warriors. It chanced that Zeppa had returned from one of his rambles at the time, and was lying in his hut. "Will you come out with us and fight?" demanded Ongoloo, entering abruptly. The mention of fighting seemed to stir some chord which jarred in Zeppa's mind, for he shook his head and frowned. It is possible that, if the savage had explained how matters stood, the poor madman might have consented, but the chief had not the time, perhaps not the will, for that. Turning quickly round, therefore, he went off as abruptly as he had entered. Zeppa cared nothing for that. Indeed, he soon forgot the circumstance, and, feeling tired, lay down to sleep. Meanwhile, Ongoloo marched away with a body of picked men to station himself in a narrow pass through which he knew that the invading foe would have to enter. He was hugely disgusted to be thus compelled to fight, after he had congratulated himself on having brought the recent palaver to so peaceful an issue. He resolved, however, only to give his enemies a serious fright, for he knew full well that if blood should flow, the old war spirit would return, and the ancient suspicion and hatred would be revived and intensified. Arranging his plans, therefore, with this end in view, he resolved to take that peaceful, though thieving, humorist, Wapoota, into his secret councils. Summoning him, after the ambush had been properly arranged and the men placed, he said, "Come here, you villain." Wapoota knew that Ongoloo was not displeased with him by the nature of his address. He therefore followed, without anxiety, to a retired spot among the bush-covered rocks. "You can screech, Wapoota?" "Yes, chief," answered the ex-thief in some surprise. "I can screech like a parrot the size of a whale." "That will do. And you love peace, like me, Wapoota, and hate bloodshed, though you love thieving." "True, chief," returned the other modestly. "Well then listen, and if you tell anyone what I say to you, I will squeeze the eyes out of your head, punch the teeth from your jaws, and extract the oil from your backbone." Wapoota thought that this was pretty strong for a man who had just declared his hatred of bloodshed, but he said nothing. "You know the rock, something in shape like your own nose, at the foot of this pass?" said Ongoloo. "I know it, chief." "Well, go there, hide yourself, and get ready for a screech. When you see the Ratura dogs come in sight, give it out, once, only once, and if you don't screech well, I'll teach you how to do it better afterwards. Wait, then, till you hear and see me and my men come rushing down the track, and then screech a second time. Only once, mind, but let it be long and strong. You understand? Now away." Like a bolt from a crossbow Wapoota sped. He had not been in hiding 2 minutes when the Ratura party came stealthily toward the rock before mentioned. Wapoota gathered himself up for a supreme effort. The head of the enemy's column appeared in view. Then there burst, as if from the bosom of silent night, a yell such as no earthly parrot ever uttered or whale conceived. The very blood in the veins of all stood still. Their limbs refused to move. Away over the rolling plain went the horrid sound, till it gained the mountain, where, after being buffeted from cliff to crag, it finally died out far up among the rocky heights. "A device of the Ratura dogs to frighten us," growled Ongoloo to those nearest him. "Come, follow me, and remember, not a sound till I shout." The whole party sprang up and followed their chief at full gallop down the pass. The still petrified Raturans heard the sound of rushing feet. When Wapoota saw the dark forms of his comrades appear, he filled his chest and opened his mouth, and the awful skirl arose once again, as if to pollute the night air. Then Ongoloo roared. With mingled surprise and ferocity his men took up the strain as they rushed toward the now dimly visible foe. Savage nerves could stand no more. The Raturans turned and fled as one man. They descended the pass as they had never before descended it. They coursed over the plains like greyhounds. They passed through their own villages like a whirlwind, drew most of the inhabitants after them like the living tail of a mad comet, and only stopped when they fell exhausted on the damp ground in the remotest depths of their own dismal swamps. Chapter 6